is because I have what some might call a dual vocational call to the ministry and into the classroom, where I've been in the church ministry in the Protestant church since I was a child. My parents are both the music ministers of the United Methodist Church, where I grew up in Oregon. And I've been involved with leadership in Protestant denominations throughout my young adult and adult life as a deacon, as well as on various different teams and mission. I'm currently the mission and outreach team lead for our St. Andrew United Church of Christ here in Sarasota, Florida, where I reside. So also have that denominational affiliation with our speaker for today, our two speakers for today with the United Church of Christ, who I'll introduce now. Erica Poellot is the Director of Faith and Harm Reduction at National Harm Reduction Coalition. As a faith leader in long-term recovery, Erica founded Faith and Harm Reduction to co-create a justice movement which connects people who use drugs, people who trade sex, and communities of faith through the development of harm reduction-centered spiritual resources, ritual support, and spiritual care. With joint MDiv and MSW degrees from Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University in New York City, Erica also works as the Senior Ministry Innovator at Judson Memorial Church in New York City and coordinates the overdose and drug use ministries for the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Co-presenting with Erica is Hill Brown, based in Western North Carolina, and who is the Southern Director of Faith and Harm Reduction. Hill was a founding member of the board and executive director of the Steady Collective, a community-based harm reduction organization in Asheville, North Carolina. Prior to their work in the harm reduction movement, Hill worked in religious communities in North Carolina, New Mexico, and Georgia. Hill is originally from Lower Alabama. I'll turn it over now to Reverend Poellot and Hill Brown for their presentation on harm reduction strategies in the faith community. I'm so excited to learn from you both, and then to hear from our panelists. We'll have three panelists sharing on the value of how a faith community can embrace and help individuals with substance use disorder and contribute to harm reduction after Erica and Hill's presentation. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And give me a second while I figure out how to reshare our screen. Can folks see this okay?
It's perfect.
Yes. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Well, it's wonderful to have everyone join us here today, and thank you to Margaret for the introduction. Excuse me, I will say a bit more about where my work is rooted and what the organizations can offer you, but first I wanted to take a minute to honor you joining us here in this space. So please feel free to join me in whatever name or names for spirit, love, and justice resonate with you. As we co-create sacred space in our being here together today, space which proclaims that people who use drugs are beloved. Let us bless this space together. Let us bless this movement for liberation, and let us do so in honor of the ministry that people who use drugs are giving life to, and in the spirit of love and justice, which connects us all. May this space we create in our being together to learn, to dream, be blessed. That is, may its inherent goodness be acknowledged. May the many stories and experiences embodied here among us be honored and held. Ours a wisdom born of surviving. May our gathering be an active reclaiming of sacred space for people touched by substance use and its stigma. May it be a place to put down whatever is heavy and to take up what is needed and deserved. May this community of ours and all who engage with it be blessed. Amen. As promised, I'm going to tell you quickly, very quickly, a little bit about HROP, which stands for Harm Reduction and Overdose Prevention Ministries of the National United Church of Christ. We are a much newer ministry to the UCC. I think we've been around for about 2.5 years, and our focus has been on equipping local churches to grow their justice and wellness ministries to include the intersectionality that harm reduction embodies, such as immigration justice, gender justice, youth ministry, economic justice, and beyond. In this context, we also provide thought partnership and technical assistance for other denominational bodies looking to establish or grow similar harm reduction ministries. Faith in harm reduction has found roots with harm reduction workers and unions of people who use drugs throughout the United States. While our work centers on helping communities build environments supportive of harm reduction in policy and practice, and providing a range of technical assistance services, the heart of our work is in lifting up the voices and lives of people who use drugs and the people who love people who use drugs through spiritual community building and care. So why harm reduction ministries and faith in harm reduction? I am here quite simply because I love people who use drugs and love people who use drugs and believe in the promise of freedom. I believe healing is possible. I think at this point, we also would love to welcome you to share why it is that you are here and interested in the chat if you feel so moved, and feel free to do so while I continue. I am also here because of the stories I have heard. The same stories I am sure many of you have heard or have lived. And that is that we live in a culture which has created a web wherein substance use, stigma are linked with a system that centers punishment over compassion, erasure over connection. And I am here because I know the story of love. And I know that death and despair do not have the final word. I imagine you are here for similar reasons. I wanted to share a few of the stories that we heard as we began this work. We heard from Terrell that he longs for spiritual community, which allows him to show up with his whole self, which recognizes in him a complex history of overcoming that does not define him by his pain, his trauma, his drug use, his history, but rather by his humanity. We heard from Marilyn that she lost her ex-love, the father of her 2 sons, to an accidental overdose in the nursing home he lived in, 1 year to the day after his brother died of an accidental overdose in his home in the Bronx, New York. She and her children were not planning to hold a funeral or a celebration of life for fear that Ralph would be stigmatized by the officiant, as he had often been in the church he was raised in and continued to seek a spiritual home in. We heard from Father Victor that his 3 parishes in Western Pennsylvania have been reeling from the loss of beloved young men, families too ashamed to name the cause of death, suffering in silence, and struggling to craft theologies which challenge their church's well-entrenched, moralistic, and individualistic views on substance use, agency, and sin. We heard from the officials in the city of New York that there was wont to construct a ceremony that honored the over 2,000 lives lost to overdose in our city in 1 year alone, which made space to mourn that people who use drugs are afforded the dignity in life that they often were not provided in life, dignity in death that they often were not provided in life. We heard from Mother Seeley that her community of faith in the South Bronx has been long devastated by overdose, by HIV, by hepatitis C, by incarceration, and is struggling to tend to the legacy of trauma while simultaneously stemming the current bleed. Give voice and action to the fury that their pain, their experience has been criminalized, brutally policed or ignored, while their white neighbors to the west are being wrapped in resources, in funding, in compassion. We heard from Jackie that as a woman of deep faith, she longs to be an architect of liturgy. Goodness gracious, sorry about this. Of stories, which is born of stories that look like hers, to lead in a place where not only is she invited out of the shadows, but she is empowered to invite others out of the shadows as well. We heard from Rabbi Busey that his role as leader of a rural congregation means he is often a first responder, that the continuum of care begins in its congregation and in the membership long before considerations of problematic substance use, addiction, and questions of care and treatment arise. We heard from hundreds of people following a sermon on the gospel of harm reduction that they had never, ever heard the drugs issue talked about with compassion, that they had never heard their story reflected with love from inside a sacred space that they had never heard themselves, their children, their lovers called beloved. Most recently, we are hearing from staff at the nation's first sanctioned overdose prevention centers that while they have saved over 650 lives in the months they have been open, that the trauma of responding to overdose after overdose after overdose is deeply wounding, that they have no space or place to share or to wear these wounds. And this is where we find harm reduction. And this is why I have faith in harm reduction. We believe in the spirit of community and connection. We trust people who use drugs to show us the way forward. With the short time we have together here today, Hill and I are going to take you through a quick journey through harm reduction in practice and in philosophy, in ways that communities of faith are crafting their own harm reduction ministries of love and justice. So I want to begin by rooting us in a way to think about substance use, which draws from the premises of harm reduction, which exist beyond the binaries of good and bad, use or abstinence, disease or not. Harm reduction supports and celebrates any positive change, while resisting a narrative that would treat the substance use spectrum as a moral ladder and celebrates any and all positive change. A positive change is one that reduces risk to oneself and one's community, that makes space for a person to pursue spiritual, emotional, and physical health and wholeness, that emerges from and increases agency. One person's positive change may be to start smoking heroin instead of injecting it, thereby reducing the risk both of overdose and of infection. Another's may be to shift from heavy use to occasional use in order to make time for a job, a hobby, a relationship. Another's may entail giving up one or more substances entirely to reduce harm. Principles of non-judgment and non-coercion require that none of these choices, that none of these kind of positions on this spectrum of substance use be treated as morally superior or inferior to another. Everyone's path is their own, but harm reduction offers compassionate, evidence-based support on the journey. For me, harm reduction has been both a way of life as well as a spiritual practice and calling, which means that it is the lens I use to guide right action, how I understand what is just, and is the way that I endeavor to be in relationship to others and to my faith. Harm reduction is also the frame and language I have used to approach my own personal healing and recovery path from substance use disorder and overdose. Harm reduction enabled me a way to show up with my whole self, to show up with and be my whole self, and to cultivate community and connection without judgment, where I was supported to explore my own path to recovery, which for me has included abstinence, moderated use, medication for opioid use disorder, and trauma care. While there is no universal definition of harm reduction, there are some shared understandings. Harm Reduction International says harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that aim to minimize negative health, social, and legal impacts associated with drug use, drug policies, and drug laws. Harm reduction is grounded in justice and human rights. It focuses on positive change and on working with people without judgment, without coercion, without discrimination, nor requiring that they stop using drugs as a precondition of support. In partnership with our sister agency, National Harm Reduction Coalition, we recently recrafted our North Star statement to read that we create spaces for dialogue and action that help heal the harms caused by racialized drug policies, rooting our work and harm reduction as a movement, and with the recognition that we are responsive to the immediate needs and lived experience of people and communities, as well as called to challenge those systems and structures which cause harm. When talking about harm reduction, we generally talk about it in three ways. The first is risk reduction, which speaks to the programs and services we provide. The second is lowercase HR harm reduction, and it is the principles and philosophy which root and guide our work, in which my colleague Hill is going to spend some time on each of those. And lastly, capital HR harm reduction, which is a justice-rooted political and spiritual movement focused on shifting power and resources to people most vulnerable to structural violence. And so now I will turn it over to my colleague Hill to talk about these in a little more detail.
Thanks, Erica. So I'm so glad to be with y'all here today, and I really appreciate the way Erica began things, really grounding us in the spiritual part of this work. And what is in front of you on this slide are examples of risk reduction strategies. And I think usually when we hear the term harm reduction, we think of these things. We think of these sort of interventions. And we don't so much think about the human rights movement that is a capital H, capital R harm reduction. If you're not familiar with some of these strategies, which you may not be, many of these are provided at harm reduction outreach programs. When I was working in Asheville, North Carolina at Study Collective, we provided syringe access, we provided overdose prevention and naloxone distribution. We didn't have an overdose prevention center. Those are rare, above ground and legal, but there are a couple in New York who are doing incredible work, and they're underground OPCs all over the world at this point. The Housing First model, some homeless shelters are now adopting this, and that means, as Erica said earlier, we're not requiring anyone to be abstinent before they receive support. And Housing First says, we will get you housing even while you are using, and understand that having supportive housing can help you make positive changes in your life, whatever that may be. Drug checking and fentanyl test strips to help folks be able to have agency in knowing what they're using, because the supply is so contaminated. And we can talk about that some more in terms of fentanyl contamination and contamination with other drugs that people aren't aware that they're ingesting when they're using drugs. Wound care, most syringe access programs provide wound care, another risk reduction tool, so that folks don't always have to go to the hospital where they may experience discrimination and stigmatizing behavior. And if folks don't get care for small wounds, then that can turn into things like endocarditis and be much worse. And so if that can be addressed early on at the site of a syringe access program, all the better. Medication for opioid use disorder or medication-assisted treatment is another way of talking about that, like Suboxone and methadone. That is a risk reduction tool. And spiritual care. So harm reductionists end up doing a lot of work besides handing out syringes. And some piece of that is sitting with folks, praying with folks if they ask, and in general, being present. And if you have questions about these, please do put those in the chat and we can answer them as we go, or we can answer them at the end. Harm reduction utilizes a spectrum of strategies to reduce the negative consequences associated with drug use, sex work, and other behaviors. So safer techniques is some of what is taught at syringe exchanges, right? So using a new syringe every time means that you're less likely to get sick, less likely to transfer things like HIV or Hep C. And it also means that you're less likely to be wounded during the injection process because you're using a new sharp needle every time. So that's a safer technique example and part of why syringe exchanges do what they do. Managed use is talking to folks about their use. Does it feel too chaotic to them? Is there a way that we can help support them in shifting their use if that's their desire? And this can also be a point at which we start talking about medication-assisted treatment or abstinence. Some folks enter a period in which they don't want to use drugs anymore. And if that's the case, then harm reductionist, which harm reduction is sometimes, because we think in very binary ways, right? That there's harm reduction and then there's abstinence. There's using or then there's nothing at all. And that's not really how we think about things. We do think about things on a spectrum. And when folks are ready to stop using totally or go into a treatment program where that's the requirement, people who discuss this with providers at syringe exchange programs, they are 5 times more likely to enter treatment than people who never interact with a syringe exchange. So that is an important piece of this, is if you're interacting with someone who doesn't treat you with any judgment, then you are more likely to enter treatment and do things that you want to do for yourself when you're ready to do them. And abstinence may be a part of that, and harm reductionists support it if that's led by the person who's asking for treatment. So health and dignity establishes the quality of individual and community life and well-being as the criteria for successful interventions and policies. Health and dignity is so important, and it's a big part of why we do this work. People who use drugs are often not treated with dignity. They're treated as if they don't know what's good for them. They're not invested in their own health. And harm reduction pushes against that and says, we believe you are interested in your own health, and we're going to help you get the tools to take care of yourself. And that's what syringe exchange is doing, is it's putting safer injecting supplies in people's hands so they have agency over their own health. When I worked in syringe exchanges, part of what we did was have conversations with people about what could be treated at home in terms of wounds and when they needed to go to the hospital. And if they had to go to the hospital and they felt concerned about that, we would go with them and help advocate for them until they were in a position to do that for themselves. So a lot about this is sort of handing the agency back to a person in our culture who we take agency from over and over again. Compassion and care calls for the non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services and resources to people who use drugs and the communities in which they live in order to assist them in reducing attendant harm. So this, again, is this non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services. So I think the reason that this keeps coming up is because so much around substance use is around moralizing, right? And so this is a shift also for people who are doing this from a faith-based perspective, is oftentimes we hear this language about clean and dirty. You know, a person who's not using is clean. And so what that automatically means is that a person using drugs is dirty. That is puritanical religious language, right? And we have to work to get folks out of that, right? A person who uses drugs is not a dirty person. They're not defiled. And so we are pushing against that too when we provide services and say over and over again, you know, there's no judgment here. We're not asking you to be in a different place. We are going to be with you regardless of where you are in your use. Leadership of people who use drugs. Sometimes we sort of have folks on the edge giving us advice who are directly impacted. And this varies, you know, in all kinds of services, homeless services, folks who are food unstable. We may take advice from them, but do we center them in the decision-making? Are we letting them lead because they really do know best what they need and how to lead the movement, because harm reduction is a capital H, capital R, human rights movement. This slide says ensures people with lived experience and communities impacted have a real voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. So an example of this would be the syringe exchange where I served. We had a participant advisory board, but that advisory board wasn't just sort of giving advice. They were making real decisions about what we ordered, where we were located, and who needed to be talking to the board of the organization. And oftentimes that was people who use drugs. Is there a problem internally? We need to be talking to the people who are being served about what those issues are. Free will and autonomy affirms people who use drugs themselves as the primary agents of change and seeks to empower people to share information and support each other in strategies which meet their actual conditions of harm. So again, this is about having people who use drugs and people who sell sex be at the center of this. They do know best what's happening to them and the way that the forces in our culture are acting on them. And we may think that we know, but if we don't have lived experience, we can't be sure of that. And things change in the world. Drug supply is always changing. And I know that to keep up on what wounds were looking like, what the drug supply was looking like, I needed to be in constant conversation and having constant direction from the people that I was serving. They weren't just people being served. They were people helping me do my job with clarity and integrity. Rooted in a justice perspective, recognizes that the realities of various social inequalities affect both people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with potential harm. So the reality of the world is that there's all kind of systemic oppression, and we know that much of this is racialized, that Black people and people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the war on people who use drugs. And we do use that language, war on people who use drugs, because you can't fight a war on drugs. Drugs are inanimate objects. So we know that the people who really suffers are the people who are using. And we know that we need to work to uproot the war on people who use drugs, because part of the harm here is that we are dealing with the prohibition of drugs, and prohibition does not work, right? It didn't work with alcohol. It's not working with other substances. And folks in law enforcement will often say, we can't police our way out of an opioid crisis. That is very true. We are not policing our way out of this. And the social inequalities that are affecting people's lives are getting worse, and people are getting more vulnerable while we're not sort of intervening here and also dealing with the justice issues, in addition to providing concrete resources like syringes. Pragmatic and realistic. It doesn't attempt to minimize or ignore the real harm and danger associated with licit and illicit drug use or other risk behaviors. So we never say that drugs don't hurt people. They certainly can. And we know that substance use has really impacted so many communities in the South and in Appalachia. Certainly the whole country has been impacted, the whole world's been impacted, but we've had disproportionate impacts in Appalachia, where I am in Western North Carolina, the overdose crisis, and we do often say overdose crisis instead of opioid crisis, because in this case, the real crisis is that folks are dying. And what I think is core here is that part of the reason that drugs are so dangerous is because we have not made attempts to regulate drugs, to decriminalize substance use, or to change the systems that sort of surround substance use, right? We know that the drug policy in this country is bad. We know that our medical system is biased against people who use drugs, and those things have to change. And in that, we don't try to say, yeah, there's nothing wrong with substance use. There are problems, and we're trying to address those both at the personal level and at the systemic level. Evidence-based. So a lot of programs in the United States are not evidence-based. They're just programs that have been around, but the numbers aren't there. Evidence-based understands substance use as a complex phenomenon encompassing a continuum of behaviors, promotes reality-based and culturally competent drug education, and supports scientific strategies for reducing health risk associated with substance use. So we have to have interventions that are backed by science and that we know are starting to work. Some programs in this country just, their rate of success is 15% or lower. If we understand in some sectors that substance use is a disorder, then we should be thinking about that in medical terms, and where we wouldn't allow any other condition to be treated with that kind of success rate, right? Something that's below 15%. So we have to start turning towards evidence-based solutions. And harm reduction is an evidence-based solution, right? We have decades of evidence showing that it does stop the spread of HIV, it does stop the spread of Hep C, and it does reduce wounds. Challenges stigma and seeks to eradicate the stigmatization of people with lived experience of substance use disorder, and sex work. And we know that stigma is really dangerous and it kills people. We've sort of collectively said, oh, people who use drugs are bad, right? Because we do connect criminal behavior with bad behavior in our culture. So if we criminalize something, then we also begin to think, oh, this person is bad. It's not just that they've done something that's criminal. So we've got to work on that. And we've got to work on sort of the religious undertones of this. Again, folks using drugs being dirty people. Stigma is a huge piece of this, and we have to address it from the way that we allow syringe exchanges in our community and how we support them. Also, the language that we use and changing that language. It's important and powerful. Multiple pathways to healing. Acknowledging that healing encompasses an individual's whole life, including mind, body, spirit, and community, values, self-determination, and supports in crafting their own unique path to positive change. We do know that people as individuals know oftentimes the things that they need. And so listening to their direction about, is what you need here, more consistent access to food, better access to housing, is a job what you're looking for? We can help folks get the things that they need. And sometimes those aren't always related to substance use. I think that's another piece of this, is like, sometimes when we are interacting with folks who are using drugs, we're only talking about their substance use, but there are lots of things around that that aren't being addressed. And it makes the substance use just something that feels like something folks need to do as a coping mechanism, as something adaptive, because they're not having any other needs met. And the harm reduction movement. Do you want me to do this, Erica? Yes? Yes, okay. Pursues a model of public health as social justice, combats the forms of racism, stigma, marginalization, and criminalization that places people in harm's way, understands the interlocking struggle against inequality and oppression, central to both health and liberation, and affirms the wisdom, dignity, and leadership of those most impacted by these harms as the keys to transformative change. So, yeah, go ahead.
Do you want me to pick it up from here?
Sure, sounds great.
Thank you so much for sharing kind of details around the values piece, is where we have found really significant buy-in from faith communities and others who are able to help make those kind of justice connections with the whole range of intersectional justice issues that we were talking about. And so as I listen into or re-listen into these principles, as Hill was talking, I hear echo of many of the tenets of my own faith and faith tradition in the call of harm reduction as a movement for healing and justice. I heard empowerment through education. I heard a focus on community, erasure of boundaries and structures which divide, grace, humanity, connection, healing, life-giving, compassion, consent, agency, dignity, wisdom, love for neighbor, preferential option for those who have been marginalized, justice with and for those whose humanity and rights have been denied. Quite simply, I see love, and I see a gospel of harm reduction. So how are communities of faith living out this gospel or practice for liberation? As we talk about them, and as we have a toolkit that we are going to share a link for, and depending on time, we might share a couple little facets of that. We've broken that down into 4 pretty concrete, albeit fluid areas. First being hospitality, second, community building, third, compassionate care, and fourth, advocacy. And I'll talk about each of these, or rather share some examples of the ways that these are being lived out in a variety of faith settings across the country. But first, at the foundation of the work across settings, and as Hill said, really recognizing that a lot of our cultural assumptions and systems and policies really derive or have been born from a lot of religious philosophy and thinking and understanding about the issues of substance use and other folks who live on the margins. And so and my understanding in that is that the way that we understand these issues reflects powerfully in the language we talk about these issues and about the issues of substance use and the people who use them. And I just want to add that I'm adding a caveat that I'm not talking about how people choose to language their own relationship with substances or healing or recovery, but I'm talking about how we talk about and or are in conversation with somebody else about their use or somebody else's use. Simply the words we say and the words we don't say have immense power. And in the toolkit and in a variety of online sources, there are language suggestions crafted by people with lived and living experience of substance use. And I want to say, I know we talked a lot about the leadership of people with lived experience of substance use. And Hill touched on this, given the kind of ongoing and evolving and rapidly shape-shifting culture and drug supply and policy environments that folks find themselves in. The leadership of people with living experience is really, really critical. And so folks that are still using drugs and is going to be really critical to ensuring that the ministries that our services that we're providing are really vital and life-giving. So, and like I said, these slides exist in the toolkit that we will share that is available for download PDF, as well as it lives online on a couple different sites. But hospitality, quite simply, I wanted to share a little bit about a couple of the programs. And Hill, I'm also going to invite you if there are things that occur to you as we're talking about these 4 categories and your kind of experience and exposure, to share some examples. So thinking about, there's an Episcopal church in Massachusetts that we have been doing a fair amount of work with over the last couple of years. And like many congregations, like many communities of faith, they have been offering space subsidized or free to organize or to 12-step fellowships, right? So AA, NA, CA, this whole range of programs that I think many of us are probably quite familiar with. And so what they were charged with doing by folks who were in community with them in a variety of ways and did not feel welcome into this space, specifically because the only offerings that were available to people who identified as having a lived or living experience of substance use were ones that required them to be abstinent or to desire to stop drinking or desire to stop using in order to attend. And so this church in Massachusetts started exploring other ways that they could open their space and be explicitly welcoming to folks who may be on a whole different part of the kind of spectrum or have different ideas about what positive change looks like. So they started hosting harm reduction works or smart recovery. They also started hosting safer injection and overdose prevention kit assembly parties, which enabled folks to be in conversation, in community, in kind of working partnership with folks who use drugs and preparing for and welcoming folks across this whole spectrum. Similarly, and this might sound quite simplistic, but on bulletin boards, bulletins, communications, how often do we communicate that there is explicit welcome for folks who are still using drugs and or maybe concerned about or love someone who uses drugs? Are we only talking about our AA and NA offerings? Are we talking about resources, community resources that are available to folks, harm reduction organizations, like I said, a whole range of other mutual aid organizations that exist for folks for whom the 12-step fellowship may not be a fit or may not have worked. So we have congregations that have begun to include a remembrance for people lost to overdose as part of their weekly standard liturgy, and such that it becomes part of the life of the congregation to be engaging with and remembering and honoring. And this does something really to shape-shift the ways that we are thinking about kind of who we are as congregations and communities and who others might be. My congregation in New York City, Judson Memorial Church, considers itself probably more wildly progressive than we ought to. but we have been offering kind of meeting space or subsidized or free organizing space for unions of people who use drugs and unions of people who trade sex for decades now. And one of the things that we were asked was that, you're inviting folks in, and we have a range of folks who would really need access to safer syringe disposal while they're in your space for 12 hours or however long these summits are lasting. And, Judson, based on the fact that we're in New York City, real estate is of the kind of utmost capital, and we get a fair amount of money from space rental from HBO and some of these other studios and corporations. Got a lot of pushback from our finance folks about really risking our finance stream, our funding sources, should they actually, be able to see that we are being fully kind of recognizing that people are sharing our space, and that we are, respectful of the ways in which folks are taking care of themselves in their communities. Any I've forgotten, Hill, around hospitality? Otherwise, I'll go to.
Well, the only thing I was going to say is that if you're in a congregation that is willing to have a training on naloxone at your site and potentially have naloxone on site, that would be fantastic. And I feel like is a pretty straightforward entry point in terms of supporting harm reduction for a lot of faith communities.
Yeah, I was going to say overdose and naloxone distribution, overdose prevention events. There's a range of, we have done a range of kind of overdose prevention worship services, which incorporate overdose prevention trainings and response and naloxone distribution as part of an altar call. As part of that, it's led by local organizers and or harm reduction colleagues, so that we can help do some of that bridge building and relationship building, which we really understand exists at the core of this work. And also, it really serves to do a lot of kind of the destigmatizing, right? If we give folks an opportunity to really, share their stories and witness to their experience and their humanity, and, being able to share space and having it be where folks who are impacted are leading those, really has had a really significant impact on the kind of readiness of congregations to accept. And so here in New York City, again, some of the ways that I have seen this acted out is, so the harm reduction education events and worship services like Hill talked about, we've convened quite a number of these events in regions all across the country, where we have invited folks across sectors to come in and do a town hall and talk about kind of what the local, the hyper-local challenges are with regards to overdose, and or, really giving attention to the nuance of local drug policies and other public health policies, that impact the ways that these ministries are able to operate. We operate a harm reduction family love feast here in New York City, and that is, again, a congregation that has a wealth of space that they're not using all the time. And so they have invited in a congregation of folks that are led by people who use drugs, people who trade sex, people who are involved in harm reduction. They gather for a monthly agape love feast. They are entirely, the ones who are co-creating and shaping this sacred space, which tells stories that look like theirs and provides opportunity for spiritual community building and some of the kind of care that we had talked about that so often our folks are not afforded or don't have access to. Compassionate care, quite got a range of different suggestions here. Each year there's the International Overdose Awareness Day, which happens on the last day of August. And so as part of our denomination in the UCC, we have begun to offer or to suggest that congregations honor a harm reduction Sunday, which happens the Sunday before International Overdose Awareness Day, so as not to interfere with that. And we have a range of resources available for congregations who are interested in exploring, and including a curriculum looking at the roots of the drug war, and strategies for ways to kind of upend that and do some kind of cultural audits within our organizations to look at ways that we have unknowingly really internalized a lot of this messaging around substance use and the people who use them. The one down below, which talks about knitting, crocheting, a prayer blanket, or bags, is one of my favorites. It's a colleague, Reverend Michelle Mathis in North Carolina, and she's based out of Hickory, North Carolina, and was hearing from local congregations that were not necessarily interested or ready in perhaps hosting a syringe service program, either a mobile unit in their parking lot or on their premises, as a lot of our faith communities have begun doing, but were interested and had a very particular ministry, which at the time they called the Happy Hookers. I understand that they have since rebranded and they are now Hooking for Hope, and it is a group of largely octogenarian crocheters in Hickory, North Carolina, who had been making medication bags for people to hang on the back of their wheelchairs and other kind of means, mobilization aids. And, had heard Michelle talk about some of the challenges for folks who are unhoused or others in carrying around safer injection supplies and access to Narcan or naloxone. And so they said, well, my goodness, we could totally do this. And so they have started knitting these or crocheting these just beautiful bags that are actually woven with reflective threads so that people can find them in low light situations and have access to Narcan. And we've also heard from folks that, having this homemade love sewn, piece of care really feels like home for folks and feels like love. And so that's been really powerful. Here in New York City, and I know I do a lot of talk about New York City, but that's where I'm based. We have the nation's first 2 sanctioned overdose prevention centers, as well as a network of harm reduction programs. And one thing that became quite clear in hearing from harm reduction programs and their staff was that folks so often are doing all this frontline response, and by virtue of being a harm reduction worker, don't have access to the same harm reduction resources that they're called or that participants might. And we're really struggling for kind of somebody to bear witness to their experience and provide space. So we have been providing spiritual care, both as part of outreach efforts in partnership with people who use drugs, who are leading a lot of the syringe distribution efforts throughout the city. We also offer, and this is a range of clergy across denominations and across faith traditions. So we do some restorative circle work with folks, with staff specifically of harm reduction organizations focused on grief work and on spiritual care. And lastly, we talked some about the overdose response kits, and Faith in Harm Reduction has been capturing kind of blessing. We asked people who use drugs and people who love them, like, what are the blessings, spells, prayers, wishes that you wish you had heard or your loved one had had the opportunity to hear. And we've crafted a kind of prayer card deck that's available online. We also provide them for free to organizations who don't have budgets to be able to purchase them. And these are being used in a range of ways. We have partners at Next Distro who are doing mail order harm reduction supplies for folks who aren't in areas where there is kind of legal harm reduction resources available, or folks who may not be able to, by virtue of being in rural spaces or others, have person-to-person contact with someone at a harm reduction program. And so they're including these prayer cards or blessing cards as part of those mail order outreach kits. We've got colleagues who are responding to non-fatal overdoses in emergency rooms throughout the country who are using these as calling cards as well for folks when they are responding. So this has been a really powerful kind of opportunity to connect congregations with existing wellness ministries that they have. So it's been a great spot. And then lastly, but not least, obviously the social capital of many faith communities and their leadership make for significant advocacy partnerships. In New York City, and I know in a range of other areas, the legalization of syringe service programs was a dynamic partnership between faith leaders, here in New York City, it was ACT UP members and unions of people who use drugs who were just absolutely devastated and rage-filled that their loved ones were dying from what they understood to be, preventable, avoidable, should they have access to sterile injection supplies and have access to compassionate care. And so Father Barrios almost single-handedly helped, expedite an advocacy campaign, which resulted in the legalization of syringe service programs here in New York City decades ago. Unfortunately, he also was put on desk duty because of that, and has only recently gotten a parish back. And also in New York City, the welcome for overdose prevention centers has been largely paved, and I will also add, and blocked by people of faith in the neighborhoods where the OPCs operate. And so we have had the real pleasure of having the opportunity of touring faith leaders through the OPCs to really have the opportunity to experience, destigmatize, normalize. And I don't think that we've had a single person who has, gone on these tours who has not said that they were not utterly transformed. We had a colleague in Chicago who now runs the only Black woman-owned faith-based syringe service program on the south side of Chicago, who decided to, in her 60s, make this change after having the opportunity to visit an OPC in Canada at the time. It was not one of the ones in the US. And then thinking about colleagues like Reverend Chris Scott and Reverend Terry Williams in West Virginia and Ohio, who both distribute illegal harm reduction resources to community members, taking on themselves the legal risk in place of community members who are more vulnerable to surveillance or to legal repercussions. So Terry has been delivering syringes and fentanyl test strips. I know fentanyl test strips were just decriminalized in Ohio a week ago, maybe it was, but had been delivering those out of the trunk of his car in the kind of areas where he serves as a pastor. And Chris is in outside Charleston in West Virginia and has been working with SOAR and some of the other overdose response teams to be able to set up these pop-up overdose response and other sites, even though they are currently criminalized in that state. And so, there are some real opportunities, and I'm going to pause because I think that we're probably close to where we want to start taking questions. And we will share this slide deck with folks. This is one of the advocacy opportunities we would love you all to contribute to. And we've got a couple hundred faith leaders across the country who are helping us uplift the need for expansion of OPCs across the country. And also we will be sharing the link to the toolkit, which has a whole range of offerings. So shall I stop sharing screen and shall we?
Yes, that sounds
great.
Yes, thank you so much. So thank you. First and foremost, thank you so much, Erica Hill, for that fantastic presentation, both in terms of the concept of harm reduction and how it intersects with our call as members of faith communities, but also some of the practical strategies for enacting those forms of harm reduction in a faith community. Really inspiring. So I want to open it up for questions for Erica and Hill. And then we will introduce the roundtable participants that we have brought together today, who are all providing different forms of harm reduction and support for individuals with substance use disorder in Kentucky. So we'd love to share their insights as well to get you all thinking about ways that faith communities can be engaged in this harm reduction work. But first, go ahead and chat any questions that you have for Erica or Hill in the chat box here, and we'll field them to them. You'll have other opportunities to ask those questions as well.
No pressure.
Can I ask a question? There's not a question in the chat yet.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so thank you guys so much for presenting. It's a great presentation, but I do have a question that'll help me navigate some of the counties I serve. So I work in rural Eastern Kentucky. And if I was to go to any church and say, would you like to participate in a syringe exchange program or open up services relative to that? Addiction itself is so controversial. Syringe exchanges are so highly contested and just stigmatized here. And I don't want to say when working with the undereducated, I want to say working with the underexposed, right? Because we've got this really captive population inside the rural regions. They don't get out much, we'll say. What would be, because I found it ineffective to go in and spearhead, right? Just to go in with my progressive ideas. They're not progressive, they're life-saving, but for my region, they're progressive. What would be the baby steps that you would suggest in engaging our faith-based communities in concepts of harm reduction?
I can try to speak to that. So Asheville, North Carolina, which I'm sure y'all all heard of, it's the second fastest gentrifying city in America. So it's an urban center in Appalachia. It likes to imagine that it doesn't sort of deal with other issues that are happening in Appalachia, but it certainly does. And then it has dynamics of being sort of an urban center. But pretty quickly, what would happen is, 30 minutes outside of Asheville is totally rural. And we would see participants quite frequently from that area. And they were sort of naming what you were naming, that folks in their area are underexposed. They don't really know anything about syringe exchange. It's a novel concept. And so when I would go talk to folks in more rural communities about, how can we expand services here, or how can y'all support us? Sort of the way, took kind of a personability tact to this. It's like, I'm sure there are folks in your community who are struggling and folks who are using. And so what are ways that we can just do the most life-saving step? And I feel like naloxone is something that folks could get on board with, right? Like EMS is already carrying this where you are. So let's just make this more accessible. Let's, as a community, go into the local drugstores and see if they have it. If they don't have it, ask some questions about why and help facilitate them getting it behind the counter and doing some education about naloxone. And I think that's a great first step.
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to say, we have our colleague Michelle in North Carolina who does a lot of work in North Carolina's rural counties. I believe that she's working in about 10 different counties. And talks about finding an issue that hits home. So faith, right? So what are the kind of points of interest or intersection where you have an in to do that kind of initial, you talked about, I liked the reframe from undereducated to underexposed. And so I think that's also what we're talking about when we're talking about having opportunities to have perhaps lower barrier conversation spaces. So maybe the church is not going to start a syringe service program, but perhaps they're going to host a community conversation about what, the impact of overdose has been on a particular town in rural Kentucky. And, we talk often about meeting participants where they're at with regards to harm reduction or kind of, taking our lead from them. And I say that, I will I will say this, and I will also add a caveat to this, that that's also been our tact with regards to, working with faith leaders. We understand that folks are coming from a range of contexts and from a range of backgrounds and from a range of, personal experiences or not with these issues, and that those deeply shape the ways that we are thinking about and responding to. So, using faith language, meeting faith leaders where they're at. I'm not going to let faith leaders stay where they're at if it's in a really problematic space, but I'm going to do the relationship building, and I'm going to do the gentle education, and I'm going to provide, help do some of that bridge building to resources which likely do exist in the area, even if they are not as of yet known. So that's a few things.
Thank you both so much. That's fantastic. And I think we'll have some interesting insights from our roundtable participants as well, especially those working in rural areas. So I'll encourage, especially Nancy, to think about how she might respond to that question as we move to her share here. But before I introduce our roundtable panelists, I want to go to Jennifer Welch. See, you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much. I work for a youth coalition in northern Kentucky, specifically Boone County, but I work closely with Covington, Newport areas that do have like opioid epidemics going on, fentanyl, etc. And in Boone County, a lot of people just don't feel like the problem exists in their, area. But a lot of people in the Covington, Newport area, I think they have that stigma of to open up those type of facilities will bring a lot of, violence, theft, dangerous people. And, I'm very involved in the recovery community, and a lot of people that I know that go in and out of, recovery tend to become different people when they are high or under the influence. And so when I hear you talk about like this kumbaya environment, I kind of wonder, have you had any incidences where you're inviting these people into the church or into these facilities where, there has been violence or theft or whatever? Because, it just seems like, it sounds like such a wonderful, beautiful, accepting, loving thing to do. But, when people are involved in drugs and substance abuse, there does tend to be a lot of, violence or, I don't know, things like that.
You want me to take it? Well, I'm happy to address it.
Yes, I would love that.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I think I've done like all kinds of work that I think is usually framed as kind of dangerous. I worked in one of the largest homeless shelters in the Southeast, which is a 1,000-bed men's shelter in Atlanta when I was younger, and done other forms of sort of street outreach. And the thing that I found consistently is, because I'm not trying to get anybody to do anything they don't want to do, I am not often the target of aggression. I get to witness like the sadness and the grief that is under a lot of defensiveness and a lot of fear, but I have not been the target of sort of aggression. We did deal with a couple of interesting incidents at Study Collective. We had a mobile unit that was like an old ambulance, and it was broken into. At one point, we were parked in a church parking lot. That's where we stored it because we couldn't pay to rent a space to store it. So it was in a church parking lot, and somebody broke into it. And I showed up the next day and it was unlocked. And I thought I had left it unlocked, but in fact, somebody had picked the lock. And what I pretty quickly discovered is what they took was food that we had left inside, and they had slept in it because it was really cold. And so what I started to ask was like, gosh, how are we failing folks that this is the kind of behavior that folks are entering into, that we're a trusted outreach provider and folks are breaking in to sleep and to eat? It's like, we don't have enough services. And I think this is the thing that keeps coming up, is like the folks we're serving may be using drugs, but also most of them are homeless. And so how are we pushing folks into a situation where they're not having their needs met and they're having to do things that we've criminalized? It's sort of like, these are survival crimes. And I think, communities will struggle with that. Like, oh, you brought this here. And the thing I always remind folks is, this is always here. We're just seeing it. And now we need to figure out how to hold space to deal with this and to act upon this. But in terms of violence, that's not a thing I've been experiencing. And the thing I often say is like, alcohol is the only substance that's positively correlated with aggression. So, I'm working with folks who are using heroin, and, it's not fights breaking out. So I don't know. That's just kind of my 2 cents on that, not to dismiss any like problems that may be arising. Again, not trying to minimize sort of things related to substance use.
Thank you so much. I love that perspective and truth, it's your experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fantastic question and the response, Hill. Very, and as Brittany said out in the chat here, another golden nugget from Hill with this reframe of survival crimes, right? I hope everybody is checking out the chat here. Some great comments and thoughts out in the chat. But now I'd like to go ahead and bring into the conversation our roundtable panelists, who, as I said, have experience with embracing harm reduction and supporting individuals with substance use disorder in their faith communities here in Kentucky. So we have Nancy Leach with us, a retired business education teacher in a public school, as well as post-secondary settings. Nancy is the coordinator of the Open Table Ministry at Beulah Presbyterian Church since 2008. We also have Debbie Bailey with us. Debbie Bailey is a certified alcohol and drug counselor with West Care Jail Recovery Program in Pike County. So may be able to speak to those areas of resistance from rural areas that might be not having as much exposure to this as an issue. You may be able to speak to that, Nancy. And Debbie as well. Debbie has served as a bivocational pastor at Grace Fellowship for more than 20 years and is currently the executive director of the Grace Community Kitchen, which serves 2 free meals each week to the homeless and food insecure population, primarily in Pike County. We also have with us Brittany Harrington, who is a peer program coordinator for Pathways in Ashland, Kentucky and Boyd County, and the project coordinator of a HRSA-funded grant called First Day Forward, a program aimed at successful reentry and long-term recovery for county jail inmates. Brittany currently coordinates peer support services for all 10 counties that Pathways serves and is responsible for certifying new hires. Brittany, in long-term recovery, works daily to advocate for people like her. Brittany is also an incredible advocate for the role of the faith community in coming alongside harm reduction and substance use recovery work. And what I wanted to share is her contributions to the Photo Voice project that I facilitated with HEAL. She's one of the Photo Voice community members and really kind of spearheaded our conversations around the role of the church in providing recovery resources. So just to highlight a few of the pieces that came out of her group's work here, we see these unused tables and chairs. I've never seen anybody in that church. I never see anyone come to that church as a representation of those unused resources. Back to the importance of different kinds of real estate, right, in supporting this work. Another image that we have here is a directory of all of the churches in Boyd County, which is a rural county. Ashland, of course, is a bigger city, but this is the sheer number of churches. It's just an incredible resource, right? We also have this image of a county church and a quote from Brittany: "We're missing a huge opportunity in our communities." I think that they just don't know how or what their role is. Churches don't really know where they fit in, and they're not invited to talk about it, right? And then finally, from Brittany's group, this image of the closed church door, representing not a lot of things happening during the week and the sense of the doors of the church being shut throughout the week. And that's sometimes the unintentional narrative that sets the community about involvement in these kinds of efforts. And then finally, with her permission, I want to highlight someone else who's in the Zoom room here, Felicia Harris with Capital Court Authority, who is also a Photo Voice participant. In her role as with Capital Court Authority, of course, she has partnered with us on overdose education and naloxone distribution efforts through the HEAL study. Capital Court Authority is a company that provides drug testing services to state agencies. But Felicia is also a very strong advocate for the integration of medication and meditation, as she phrases it here in her Photo Voice work, and has these images of a medication for opioid use disorder over images of her own personal Bible hanging in her office. And she also does OEND and naloxone distribution outreach with faith communities in Louisville, and has said she's willing to answer questions and share about these experiences. But I just want to highlight this work that she's created here, putting these two individual pieces together, and kind of her attitude of meeting people where they are in terms of how they want to relate to a spiritual aspect of their recovery. So she says, we can't put that expectancy on everyone. And I think that's especially the way I try to run my office, is sitting down with them and saying, what's worked, what hasn't? Because I get some individuals, and they're not even atheists. They're just like, I don't want to do anything with God. Don't talk to me about God. They don't want anything faith-based. And then there's some people who are saying, can you take me to church? I'll go with you right now. I'll come to we can go to church together. I've got Bibles in my car. I'll pray with you right now. We can talk about reconnecting with your mom. A lot of agencies, a lot of programs don't have the staff or time or ability to do that. So just wanted to lift up her work and say that she is in the Zoom room here to answer questions as well. But first, I'd love to invite our panelists to briefly share what they're doing in their congregations and in their faith communities. Tell us a little bit more about their work. Let's start with Nancy, then Debbie, and then Brittany.
I'm located in southeastern part of Jefferson County. Louisville, of course, is our largest city, so I wouldn't classify us as a rural area necessarily, but we are in a suburb. 14 years ago, our church started a weekly meal brought on by the fact that 4 homeless men were living on our property. And as just mentioned, we felt that the doors were shuttered on our church except on Sunday and or for activities that were producing revenue for the church. So several of us felt that there was a better way to use this property and our facilities. And so we started the Open Table Ministry. We have since been joined by Southeast Christian, one of the larger churches here in Jefferson County, as well as Fern Creek United Methodist Church, which is right across the street from us, in providing these meals for our community. 3 years ago, we were approached by the Volunteers of America to see if it was possible to have a needle exchange program on our property in conjunction with the meal on Tuesday evening. The person from Volunteers of America actually did the legwork. She visited the fire department. There are 2 schools in close proximity to our church, one a high school, one an elementary school. She visited there more or less as an educational program. And then she met with our local council person, and they all joined in. So basically the community was in support of providing this service. And then we were tasked with, you might say, educating our parishioners as to what was going to be taking place. The Volunteers of America did provide this service for a little over a year, and then their funding expired, and it is now provided by the Jefferson County Health Department. So that is our story from a local church in more or less an urban setting.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I think I may have flipped in my head whether Nancy or Debbie was affiliated with a rural church. It's actually Debbie who was. So if you could comment, Debbie, if you have any reflections on the original question about approaching rural communities, it might not have as much exposure with how you language that. And we'll take it to you, Debbie.
Thank you so very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this and appreciate having an opportunity to be a part of this discussion. I guess, as you said, I'm a pastor in a very small church in Pike County, Kentucky. And one of the things that we started several years ago, we started doing meals on an infrequent basis, and we progressed from there as we saw the need. And for 7 years, we've been serving meals, and we serve them twice every single week, every Monday and Thursday. And so we have a lot of people that come in, not just the food insecure, but we have a lot of people who struggle with addiction that come in to our place as well. And, that's one of the things that, in listening to the presentation today is, we want to treat people with respect and with dignity and with love and with compassion, with concern. And when they come in our doors, they know that they are accepted. They know, regardless of what situation, what condition they're in, they're going to be able to come in. They're going to be able to find a meal. We have a shower. Someone can come in. They can take a shower. We have a washer and dryer. We will wash their clothes. We will do everything within our ability and power to try to help someone. We also try to direct with services. If I know if they're interested in Celebrate Recovery or NA or AA or whatever it is, I try to direct them, try to encourage them. I'm very pro, I know this is another discussion, but very pro if someone, they find help however they can find help. And if it's a medicated assisted treatment, try to direct them to the resources that will give them the help that is needed. We also have a blessing box on the outside of our building. And that is one of the things, and maybe speaks to the other question that was asked. Our local health department comes around to the blessing boxes, and they will put information about the needle exchange program along with a little bag of candy, because we have a lot of people that frequent it looking for food, and then they find information about the needle exchange program. Also, during our meals from time to time, we will have someone come in from the health department or from some other source in the community to provide information and help help for people also, because education is truly a key to, I think, reducing the stigma that's associated with people, because they're not dirty, as Hill said. They are people who have a disease, they have a problem, they have a struggle, and they need help. And so our goal in our community is to be the hands and the feet of Jesus Christ. We're not to preach, we're not to browbeat, we're not to try to convert people. We are to love people. And if we love people, we believe that Jesus can change them through whatever process he chooses to use, because ultimately he is the one that has to cause that change.
Amen, Debbie. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much, Nancy. Brittany, let's hear from you, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, my grandmother refers to me as a poinsettia. She said I need to be like a dandelion. She said I church hop during the holidays and I need to be planted all year long. But I'm definitely a church hopper. I draw faith from everywhere, and church is a really important part of my life and my faith. I want to start with what I'm going to say with a quick story. In 2007, I reached out for help for the first time, and I did that through a church that was planted near my trailer park. I showed up at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, and I knew when to show up because it was on their sign out front. I walked in the doors with my 7-month-old baby and drew every bit of strength that I had to get there by walking, because I was incredibly, incredibly sick from drug withdrawal. I lacked the basic physical and emotional needs that my baby needed, and I needed help. I just needed someone to help me. I walked in the doors of that church bawling, crying. I sat on the back seat while everybody congregated and socialized, and they began that service without addressing me. Now, and I'm not condemning them. I made eye contact with several people, and I knew they were going to talk to me, and I needed that warm welcome. I needed a hug. I needed someone to hold my baby for a moment. And I left before the service was over, just completely broken. I didn't reach out again until I was incarcerated. That was an eye opener to me, because I know what it feels like to need a resource that was close to my home. Several of the pictures Margaret showed was from the community that I live and work in. I live on a stretch of road in rural Greenup County where offshoots of that road are all hollers. I mean, there's probably 15 on my road, and down every one of those hollers are a church. Every single one of them. Walking distance from someone's home, walking distance from someone's children. Our churches have limited themselves in a couple of ways, but our society has also limited our church's roles in public service as well, right? Before social services were expanded and there in every community, our churches played a major role in supporting our community's needs. When social service agencies were created, it became the hub for people with needs, right? So our churches kind of felt pushed back. Now we've got this huge expansion of funding to address the opioid crisis, which further isolates our church. We've put them in professional settings, and churches feel uncomfortable navigating that. I really feel like we're missing the buck in inviting churches to formal discussions about treatment and modalities and things that we can do. I also feel like churches in my region have really limited, like the days of the church van are long gone. You can't get a church van to come pick you up anymore. When I was a little girl, raised in incredibly just horrendous situation. My parents were drug and alcohol users. I knew that Wednesday night I could go hang out with my friends because I had a ride to a church and a youth program. Right. I'm personally trying my best to engage churches in my region by asking them to contribute to programs that we run. For instance, we have the reentry program that Dr. McGladrey talked about called First Day Forward. And part of our program is passing out postcards and asking our church members from the local churches to write inspiring message to our inmates. So when they open that resource packet, there's a personalized message wrote from a stranger that says, you can do this. You can find hope. You can find faith. And also remind everyone, like the principles of recovery and the principles of a faith-based organization are literally the same thing. I really hope churches, especially in my region, lower their standards for participation. It's not really until the last couple of years of my recovery that I'm even acceptable now to walk into a church, right? That I know how to dress. I cuss far less than I used to, but sometimes I don't feel like I'm worthy enough. Actually, this just happened last week. We needed $100 to pay for a guy's sober living entry. So we didn't have the funds, which I work in community mental health. We never have funds. But we cold called churches, and a church asked us, Is he doing everything that he's supposed to do? And what I heard was, is he worthy of my money? Is he worthy of my help? And that crushed me, right? Because this guy needs sober living. He reached out to us. I need help getting in here. And I really, truly feel churches want to help and they want to be engaged in this process. They just don't know where to start. They have the building. Dr. McGladley showed the video of the chairs and tables that get used once a week in a Sunday school room. They have tools and resources and health and love and acceptance to offer. We just got to figure out how to marry these two worlds of people who need help and hope and people who have it. It's just going to take some hustle, I think.
Yes, I hope you see in the chat, Brittany, powerful message. Yes, and why we wanted to have you in this conversation is the need that folks in doing the work on a day-to-day basis see and the role of this work. So I'd like to open it up for any questions for the group. I have some questions from what you all had shared ahead of time, some really excellent questions, but we only have a few minutes left here before our time runs out and want to give you all the opportunity to ask our panelists about their experiences. Remember, we also have Felicia here who's doing that work that I told you all about. All right, well, with hearing no questions here from the group, I'm wondering if I could raise for all of the panelists, and this includes Erica and Hill, anyone who'd like to contribute to this. How do you see faith-based approaches being incorporated into medical and behavioral best practices? Is it either or can they coexist and be supportive? And I wanted to offer from Felicia here an example of how she had addressed this in her own work with the Photo Voice Project, where she has the image of the medication for opioid use disorder over a specific scriptural passage here from John. She said, I feel like there's such a stigma around medication, but if you look at it the way Christ worked, he used mud to heal a blind man. He used spit to heal a blind man. There's healing water, there's other elements, and I feel like he's just blessed us with science to do some of those healing elements in the millennial age. So I'll open it up to the panelists. What thoughts do you have on this kind of integration of the medical model that Brittany was alluding to, that's in some ways pushed out the church and this kind of professionalization of treatment, and how these two kinds of forces for harm reduction can coexist?
Just like to share a thought. I believe the best is to merge the two. I mean, you go to a medical doctor for any other health crisis that you have. It's not either or. You know, you go to the doctor and you don't have your part to play. We each have our part to play. And I think the best approach is how can we help somebody? You know, from the church part, we give encouragement, we love, we help, but you also have to do medically, you know, what will help you. And so the best is to marry the two together to give the person the best chance of recovery.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think churches need to look at their skills from the inside. We had a church just right down the road here that said all day Saturday, free oil changes. Come community, come if you need it. We'll offer free oil changes. They had a guy in the church that was a mechanic, didn't care at all. I think churches need to say, what do I have to offer our struggling communities, and then make it happen. But I think medical communities and treatment centers, formalized treatment centers, often are so formalized that there's not space for those volunteer programs. So on the flip side of that, we have to make sure our organized places, our formalized treatment centers, have to make sure there's room for churches to come in, there's room for volunteers.
Great, thank you. Felicia.
Thank you for allowing me the space to speak. I think that a lot of places of faith have the fear that using medication and looking into the different treatment options reduces the ability for God to work. And there's just that fear that if medication fixes it, did meditation not fix it? So you have to look at faith as a whole, where use us as an example. So Capitol Court Authority is the biggest private probation office. Our owner, Kyle Thompson, who's also on this call, he gives us that space and the ability to not be formalized. How many probation offices do you know are helping with birth certificates and bring in harm reduction and talk about naloxone and offer condoms for our sex workers and, you know, a snack or a drink or whatever they need at that time. So places of faith have to look at that as well. And I think it's just that difficult first step. So that's why I put in the group chat, it's just that education. I asked them, what can we do to have you join our team? Because if that door stays closed, then all the chaos will continue to be around. Opening that door doesn't necessarily allow the chaos to come in. But if they open that door and see that this war is out there, whether we want to realize it or not, but if we come in with that open heart and that open mind and that loving atmosphere, then they will be more accepting for us to offer them the treatment that they need. So it's just really just reducing that fear and that stigma that maintenance programs don't work because we just need to pray for them. Well, I can pray for you and send you a treatment all at the same time.
Beautiful, Felicia. Thank you so much. And I see a hand raised from Katie. Katie, could you take us home with your comment to finish up our conversation today?
Yes. My quick question is, I'm a faith-based liaison with Addiction Recovery Care, and my whole job in Louisville is reduce shame and stigma within the faith community. And I kind of see, some faces look familiar on here. My question is, I loved what Hill said earlier, was this spectrum of like harm reduction awareness and the spectrum of, and that's kind of how I go into my faith community here and say, where are they kind of on the spectrum? Nancy's church is actually a place that I stopped by a couple times last year to find out, hey, they're doing great work. My question is, often I see people, I try to connect like clothes closets, food pantries are like front line, right? Our churches, our hospitals, and our court systems often catch people when they're in need or in substance use. But churches aren't always aware. So my question is, moving someone from like a closed closet, food pantry awareness, what does that look like to continue them down the spectrum? What have you found encouraging? Maybe it's community support, maybe it's more consistency from like the local community asking. Is it resources dropping off? What do you see as moving them along that spectrum of awareness of substance use disorder support? Or, so love to hear what you think would be the best next steps.
Roundtable, what do you got? Go ahead, Erica.
I was going to say, I didn't want to cut off any of my colleagues who were in the Kentucky area. No, and I think it's exactly what I've seen a number of folks put in the chat and folks lift up, that it's about this relationship building. It's about helping to identify strengths. And, we don't want churches being medical providers or substance use treatment providers or any of those things. We want to expand the team, right? So it's inclusive of a range of resources, which really, reflect the diversity of kind of what community needs and deserves. And so I think that the kind of relationship building continues to be a piece. I think providing opportunities to kind of do some of the bridge building or connecting with other local harm reduction providers or others. So thinking about, colleagues I know in the Louisville area who are doing harm reduction specifically, and, finding ways to do this kind of cross support or cross pollination of resource sharing that Brittany and others have talked about, and continuing this kind of education piece and leading with curiosity. I think your question is great. It's like, how and in which way can we equip you or connect you or assist you in kind of making this opening?
And I want to say something real quick. If someone can create a toolkit that we can give to churches, that's simple, like front and back. What can my church do to help solve our opioid crisis, our overdose crisis? How can my church be involved? I would love that. Please email me. I'm dropping my email in the chat.
Ours is definitely not a one-pager. That there are multiple one-pagers you can take out of it, but happy to send you. We do have some other one pagers kind of around harm reduction, but we do have this toolkit, which I think has some really both concrete as well as, kind of more philosophical and including ritual and other liturgical resources, which I know has also been a big ask, is folks just are really desiring the ability to better language this issue and to do so in a way that uplifts folks and doesn't stigmatize. So I'll share that.
And Brittany, I'm in this region, so I can come to you. Like, I can be there in person, IRL, and talk to folks, talk to churches if that's useful.
You will gravely regret that.
No. I've seen it all at this point.
Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for these contributions. And again, look out in the chat at some of the responses that we're getting from the uplifting ideas and commitment to harm reduction that we're hearing from in so many different ways from our various panelists and roundtable participants. Thank you all so much. And please know that these resources, from the slide deck to the toolkit that Reverend Poellot mentioned, are going to be sent out to all of the people who are registered for this event. So I'll take it over to Lisa to tell just a little bit more about what will be coming to you as we conclude this session.
I will go over this real quickly, and I will stay on for anyone that has questions because I know we're out of time. And I also will send a follow-up email. But in the chat box, let me just send this out right here before I get started here. I have put in all the links for getting your CE credits. And if this is the first time you're doing that, contact me and I'll be happy to walk you through that. So if you need a CE credit, a certificate of attendance, or for those of you that are licensed alcohol and drug counselors, I have that link right there in the chat box, and you just fill out that information and you will get your certificate. For those others, that nurses, social workers, physicians, the CE credit will be at the CE Central Get Credit. And what you do is just enter that activity code that is in the chat box. And right away, you'll get your certificate once you fill out that information. For those of you that are in our Wave 2 counties, that's Bourbon, Campbell, Carter, Greenup, Jefferson, Jessamine, Knox, and Mason, our Wave 2 resource guides are ready. So if you want one of these guides, and they're very helpful information, a lot of available resources that you can use and share with your faith communities, send me an email, and they come in wallet size, they come in the trifold, and we will send out to you and send them to you, these resource guides that are very, very helpful. And then lastly, the link is here in the chat box. We do want your feedback, what you thought about the session, and what would you like to see going forward in future sessions. We really do value your input. And as we end here, I just want to shout out again to Erica and Hill for a wonderful presentation, and to our panelists, Brittany and Nancy and Debbie. They did a fabulous job. I really enjoyed the session so much. I really learned a lot. And thank you again. And hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.